Good afternoon, colleagues, friends. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and welcome to the first session of the Teaching and Learning Strategy Group. The focus of this session is on university teaching and learning, decolonization, and scholarship. We welcome our esteemed speakers, Professor Vasu Reddy, who is the Dean of Humanities at the University of Pretoria, Professor Liz Lange, who is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Teaching and Learning at the University of Cape Town, and Ms. Trudy van Wyk, who is the Chief Director, Social Inclusion and Quality in the Department of Higher Education and Training. We look forward to their presentations. We also welcome our scribe, Ms. Jennifer Snyman. She will take notes of the proceedings in the teaching and learning sessions. In line with the theme of this conference, An Engaged University, this session has to explore what it means to be an engaged university from the teaching and learning point of view. It cannot be gainsaid that our education system is replete with colonial vestiges which continue to shape and influence it. So as we reflect on what it means to be an engaged university from the teaching and learning perspective, we must re-engage the questions that are central to the teaching and learning enterprise. So let me just frame the discussion this afternoon in terms of these fundamental questions. Of course, the first very important question is, what do we teach? What do we teach? And how do we teach? What do we value as knowledge? Which scholarly voices are heard and which ones are silenced? We must engage this. Which narratives are embraced and which ones are sidelined and ignored? What does it mean to be a university in a society in which grinding and debilitating poverty and inequality are at every turn? Are we sufficiently attuned to the challenges that face our society? Are we responsive to them? Now, when we promise young people of our country and beyond access to quality higher education, what kind of knowledge are we creating access to? Do our curricula draw on wide and diverse epistemic cultures and traditions from diverse parts of the world? Or are we still privileging knowledge from some parts of the world to the exclusion of that which comes from other parts of the world? Are we privileging certain ways of knowing, certain ways of doing, and certain ways of being without paying due regard to different ways of knowing, doing, and being? And how do we construct the teaching and learning space so that it affords students authentic, deep, and transformative intellectual engagement? Are we reflecting sufficiently on the pedagogic philosophies and approaches that underpin our curriculum? Do we know our students? If we are to engage them meaningfully, how do we construct them as empty vessels waiting to be filled with information, or young people with lived experiences, and that they have certain knowledge which may either facilitate or hinder acquisition of new knowledge. And that there is a lot of learning, unlearning, and relearning that they have to go through. Do we understand their hopes, their dreams, and their aspirations? Do we understand their fears and concerns? Are we just teaching ahead, or we are developing the whole person? Do we produce ethically engaged, empathetic, knowledgeable, skilled, and democratic citizens? These are some of the issues that I think we must deliberate on if we are to be a truly engaged university. Let me invite Professor Vasu Reddy to address us. Over to you, Professor Reddy.
Thanks very much, Dr. Mabizela, for those very important introductory remarks. I have 20 minutes, and I think with that, I'm going to invite Cindy Kai to share the screen so I can get started. Thank you. Thanks very much, Cindy. So thanks very much, colleagues. And I'm also delighted to be part of this really great panel of colleagues who I think there might well be clear synergies between what we say in the Teaching Learning Strategy Group focused on teaching and learning, but perhaps more importantly, to share with you the purpose of this conversation that I share. It's not really a lecture with deep analysis, but it's really, to a large extent, a descriptive presentation that represents work in progress in the sector that I've been leading with 8 universities in the country, which I will explain in due course. And in many ways, the presentation has particularly 3 components: a preamble that I'm going to spend a little time on this first slide, the title slide that you see on your screen, and then I will move into what I would term the broader context and purpose of the project, out of which some of these observations arise, and then to present some snapshots of some practical interventions around this creature called the curriculum, which is quite critical and central to the teaching and learning project, and then make some tentative conclusions. They're certainly not conclusions in any definitive way. So maybe just then to start, that this session takes place in the context of the Engaged University Conference, really focusing on the idea of what an engaged university is. And of course, a central theme that arises in this presentation is the significance of the curriculum, which has gained traction in the last couple of years in particular. The Engaged University, as I understand it, is an active, directed, energizing, reflective, and transformative space. I mean, there could be other concepts that could be used to think about it. That leads me, as part of the preamble, to what the context and purpose of this is. Nothing happens in a vacuum. There's a lot of preceding moments in history that help us think about it. Of course, we all know, those of us involved in higher education, the growing dissatisfaction with syllabi and teaching methodologies and models that have become, fallen under scrutiny, really underpinned in many ways by the social movement for transformation in higher education, but more importantly, I think, really induced with the student movement since 2015. And I think that's quite a wonderful set of, stimulation to re-energize, as I'm thinking, the university environment. If we all agree, many of us in higher education, that in the first 2 decades of democracy, that access and diversification were central in the demographic sense as features of the democracy in higher education, then one could say at a conceptual level, in the recent decade, we have seen an urgency to return to the idea and meaning of the curriculum within the larger project, obviously, of epistemic decolonization that Dr. Mabizela referenced. Frankly speaking, the curriculum has become a change driver in higher education. Beyond other factors, not minimizing them, it is a wicked problem, yet it presents as a problem a moment of crisis, but a moment of opportunities. And to a large extent that the curriculum has been a neglected element. For me, and for all of us, I think a curriculum doesn't operate in a vacuum. It is really shaped by interlocking factors. Central amongst them is the social context and how we engage it in terms of knowledge systems as sites of contestation. They're never pre-given. A second dimension, which is also quite critical, is the promotion of the diversity of knowledge, thinking about its epistemic diversity. And thirdly, I think in the Teaching and Learning Project is rethinking the meanings of pedagogy and practice. How do we strengthen modes of delivery and stimulating new ideas and methods? And perhaps more importantly also, fourthly, the exposing the hidden curriculum, which is all relevant and embedded practices. And how do we redeploy or redefine or thinking about identification and identity? And I think an assumption underlying all of this is the question of telos and purpose, that a curriculum and curriculum reform is really centered into a future and really not just simply the present, about, you know, the kind of society we want to create, the kind of graduate attributes we want to develop in terms of better learning, the kind of improvements we want to make to our universities and the status, and of course, indeed, repositioning ourselves for a competitive future. There may be many, many other things as well. But central amongst all of these issues, the question of curriculum as well. And I mean, we who work in higher education recognize what curriculum means and how it is constantly redefined. Central here are some conceptual ideas and thinking about curriculum as a set of purposeful, intended experiences. But there are the views. It's about making informed decisions about educational goals and how best to achieve it. But perhaps more importantly, I'm reminded by the sociology of education, a sociologist rather, Bernstein reminded us that curriculum is what counts as valid knowledge, and how relevant that phrase or concept has become in recent times. That a curriculum is about valid knowledge, but it's informed by a set of choices, and those choices are not always neutral and innocent. You know, there are underlying principles that legitimate certain curriculum choices and certainly not others. And perhaps more importantly, when we think about curriculum, how important it is to recognize where it is located. And again, I have been influenced and I share that with colleagues, and I'm sure most of you are aware of this as well, that curriculum operates to a large extent, following Bernstein, in three particular modes of processes, if I could put it like that. What is known as the field of production, in other words, the site where new knowledge is created. A second issue is the field of recontextualization, in other words, the sites where knowledges become rearranged and transformed into curricula, and perhaps very important for us in this notion of unsettling paradigms and thinking about humanities disciplines, and perhaps one could say not just unique to humanities, but certainly to other disciplines as well, is a field of reproduction. In other words, the sites of teaching and learning. And I think following Bernstein, and this is so important to consider as an idea, is the field of recontextualization is where we are to a large extent in many, many ways, where there's great conflict and struggle for position. And I think that is the critical issue driving us. Of course, we can all talk with our experiences beyond the student movement and change required in higher education, the impact of COVID. I'm not going to go into that and how that has also impacted the way we do our work and our business. And so this particular project that I'm reporting on, as I said, is descriptive, is really about unsettling paradigms. When you unsettle, you are disturbed. You call into question particular assumptions, concepts, values, and practices. And they are central to the project of epistemology, the knowledge we make and we create and we construct, but also central to our ontology, our existence, our being, our identity. And all of these things are induced in many ways by the decolonial turn, which is a very nuanced, layered, and a slippery concept, but really quite strategic in thinking about how we reorganize and rethink knowledge in the epistemological case, but also in the historical case, secondly, about how we reconstitute social relations in our society. And if you could move to the second slide, Cindy. And so this is a project I report on, following my preamble, that was funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation a few years ago, bringing together 8 research-intensive universities. I did not choose them as the PI of the project. That is the funding requirement. You could see the universities displayed on your screen who came together around this particular project, which I want to share with you. If you could move to the next slide. So it's a project that is 5 years, and of course we all recognize in higher education that no project lasts 5 years. The Ideas Project is ongoing and unfinished business, particularly recognizing the higher education curriculum, that it's neglected, that we need to reinduce and reignite transformation. In particular, the decolonial turn is a trigger in this project, and I think brings with him great prospects for thinking about the meaning of the curriculum and the ideas we propose. Funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation in New York, and I must recognize the work and support of Professor Salim Badat, who was the previous director of this particular division within Andrew Mellon. Next slide. So the project aims in broad brushstrokes is really, I can go in any order, frankly, to test untested assumptions in our curricula, particularly humanities and social sciences, to prioritize local challenges and bringing in other insights, particularly global south, which has often been marginalized, as Dr. Mabizela was highlighting in his preamble, and to promote and ignite interepistemic dialogue, in other words, recognizing knowledges from other contexts, bringing in comparative analysis, offering fresh insights for the humanities, and of course, shifting towards an inclusive and democratized curricula. Of course, democratized is discursive, so we can debate that, and what might be democratic to one might be quite bureaucratic and otherwise to others. If we could move to the next slide, Cindy. And so the conceptual frame of this project, colleagues, has 3 levers, perhaps maybe 4, I would say. It is, if you use the alphabet R, it is shaped by recovery, reassessment, and repositioning. In this particular slide, we highlight the issue centrally of these interlocking elements. The project is fundamentally focused on dismantling received notions, the minimizing of local knowledge, in other words, to highlight that and heighten that and change and address that to support scholars and marginalized voices. The point around polyphonic understanding of curricula and canon is really central, because polyphony comes from the Russian, it's a linguistic term, but it really comes from the Russian theorist Mikhail Bakhtin, writing at the 19th century, who really profound work around recognizing the diversity of voices in the way it is able to bring particular strengths and attributes to understanding ideas. And that's central to the idea of recovery, as you see some of the intentions highlighted in this particular conceptual frame. Next slide, Cindy. The second frame is reassessment, and really reassessment is fundamentally, to a large extent, precisely about retrospection, looking back, but also interrogation of prominent figures. Of course, in current syllabi, who do we study? In topics and subjects, how do we rethink and redefine? In other words, one might ask, rather than dispensing with Freud or ancient Rome, it's just an example, you look at numerous others, what do they have to teach our current students, and what do others other domains of knowledge bring to us. In other words, in terms of what topics we teach in combating ingrained attitudes, and of course, how do we reinterpret the legacy of thinkers? Fanon has stood out, but he's certainly not the only one. And in reassessing, it's really about bringing to the fore and challenging attitudes. The third conceptual frame, thanks Cindy for the next slide, is about repositioning. So you can see there's an action-oriented dimension in thinking about these things around historical forces. How do we mainstream marginalized voices across disciplines? And some might say this is all not, rocket science or new. These are things we're doing, but I think these are things that are actually forcing us to reflect deeply about entanglements, relationships, because we are not insular, and the interconnectedness between all of this in thinking about, frankly, recovery, reassessment, and repositioning. And so, colleagues, with that, before I move to the next slide, it's really to emphasize that, it's about an ecology of knowledge. In creating a new ecology of knowledge, it's recognizing the absences and gaps in no prescriptive way, but in creative ways. And I wish now to turn to some practical examples of snapshots of projects that have been implemented within this broader context of decolonization of the humanities curriculum. There are about over 25 projects running across the universities in the country. It's impossible for me in this short time to give a detailed reflection of everything. And so I've had to make some choices, and colleagues who are listening into this conversation are very welcome to write to me, and I'm happy to share what underlies some of these projects that have been funded. And they're really fascinating. This first one in the slide that you see is entitled Praxis, Dealing with the 3 Rs. It might not necessarily immediately reflect the project of curriculum transformation, but it's actually a significant intervention in the project in the higher education sector, if not in this country, if not, if I may say, certainly globally. And that is the establishment of a journal of decolonizing disciplines, certainly in my estimation, I think the first. And I must add and recognize that this particular journal was the brainchild of one of our master's students, Siseka Kumalo, who is now currently a doctoral student at the university as the founding editor, and who did this work in its conceptualization in the Mellon Scholarship. And we are delighted that we have published several volumes. And really the journal is open access, dedicated to a unique way of thinking theoretically of decoloniality and indigeneity in higher education, and is a space that facilitates intellectual work in broad, cutting-edge ways, and is responsive to not just simply the humanities and social sciences, but all disciplines. Fascinating work, and I encourage colleagues to please access the journals and the site that's listed there in the URL, and to take a look for yourself what is being offered, and to invite colleagues also to present us with papers. It's of course a peer-reviewed journal, double-blind at that. Let me turn now, Cindy, to another example of more practical nature. This is a course at the 3rd year level in political sciences at the University of Pretoria, subtitled Concepts and Conceptions. Very interestingly, the challenge the lecturer set for himself here was to build an awareness of the plurality of voices and also of those that are in our local context. And of course, you will see from the descriptor there of contexts, not just simply in Africa, from a broad range of traditions. The teacher of this course worked with a text focused on justice and rationality, and asked a wide range of questions conceptually, fundamentally foregrounding the question of justice, which is so central to what we do in the university context, and how justice is conceptualized, what dominant discourses exist, And how do we bring different varying views to bear on students' thinking? I mean, you can see there as a broad example from Egypt, the idea of the Mayat, if I'm pronouncing the Arabic correctly, around connective justice, thinking about truth, justice, and cosmic orders, the work of Diop, and African philosophy, Ubuntu, and the Gakaka courts in Rwanda. Of course, Plato features, Confucian thought, Judeo-Christian, Hebraic tradition, the libertarian views on justice as freedom, justice as fairness in the liberal context, justice as happiness in the utilitarian, and of course the postmodern, which centralizes questions of power. I think students were really enamored by this course and really opened. And I asked the lecturer in this course to give a sense of what he attempted to do, and I'm just quoting from him. He said, in this module, I teach students to engage with the substance of positions and not merely to respond to stereotypical images or labels that might be attached to them. Understanding a position does not necessarily entail agreement, but endeavoring to understand a foundation of respect for other views, which I think is really at the heart and the lung of thinking about this. It's an exciting course and really gaining traction and highly popular. And again, arising out of the interventions made in curriculum transformation. Let me give you another example, this time beyond UP, and Dr. Mabizela taking it to your university at Rhodes, a fascinating course by the Department of History at Rhodes University titled Introduction to Creative History. What makes this course fascinating and innovative is the way in which it repositions not only what is taught, but also how we teach and learn. And it really introduces students to the emerging field of creative history and utilizes pioneering humanities methodologies to make knowledge more productive, inclusive, and also produces a combination of history with various forms of artistic expression, teaching students theoretical concepts and planning skills, rather importantly. And of course, the course is focused on local history, but it brings in performing artists as well. I cannot go into the detail of the course, but really to say as an introduction, the following aspects are covered. Why do we need transformation in historical studies? How relevant is it today more than ever? What do we gain from blending art and history? And of course, the prejudices often held by members of the public against history, I think is also central. And it illustrates in this course examples of creative history that people enjoy and how the creative history methodology could be used in several ways. Skills that are emerging in this course: project management, the use of imaginative text, short drama, storytelling, developing a podcast. You can see the connection to technologies. And of course, very interesting central themes that are covered in this course at Rhodes. Early colonial encounters between Europeans and Africans, Black voters in the Cape pre-apartheid, how the group areas act tore communities apart, and artists who went into exile to fight apartheid. It's a fascinating course that I believe now is being developed into an honors module. And as the course coordinator explained in the report, it makes exploration of the past everybody's business. And I think that's at the heart of thinking about this. Let me turn to another example, Cindy, the next slide. And here we go to Stellenbosch. It's a third-year undergraduate course, and it's titled Toppling Visual Regimes, a fascinating comprehensive project which is a critical, reappraisal of the current syllabus, and of course, challenging Eurocentric framing, and also the theorization of art history and visual culture at South African universities. Unfortunately, I cannot go into all of the details, but I think the design and implementation of 2 undergraduate courses have been central to the innovations here. What is titled The Materiality in African Art and Visual Culture, and interestingly, a module on decolonizing strategies in African visual culture. And it really brings to bear a fascinating array of not just simply what is to be decolonized, but also the who of involvement in creating and implementing this. This has a very interesting development, this course at Stellenbosch, which is currently in development stage into an online master's degree in African cultural studies, which I think is highly overdue, not just simply with Stellenbosch, but with other universities in the context, on the continent. Makerere, Dar es Salaam, Yaoundé, Malawi, Ghana, Nairobi, Botswana, and a network of African cultural studies. Part of the work has been published by Wits University Press last year in a book led by Professor van Robroek titled Troubling Images, Visual Culture and the Politics of Afrikaner Nationalism. And then my final slide before I conclude, Cindy and colleagues, is central to the project of curriculum transformation is the work of students that has often been neglected. I want to emphasize that this is a project of joint labor of academics and students in the pursuit of recovering, reassessing, and repositioning. One of the major projects emanating there, as you see, is a book project. Now, I'm still in the that slide. I'll be finished in a second. Is Living African Feminist Theory, Gender, Race, Class, and Sexuality. It's an edited collection of 16 undergraduate essays produced by students at the University of Stellenbosch in the Western Cape, reflecting on lives. Dr. Mabizela talked about student lives and how this features in new knowledge emanating from the South. Fascinating in terms of thinking about students as knowledge producers and not just simply subjects of knowledge, but creators of knowledge. And finally there, the UFS initiative for the creative of African narratives, broadly titled I Can, which is a debate we're all familiar with, at the Center for Teaching and Learning at UFS. Interestingly, the bulk of prescribed texts utilize academic skills training that was largely generated from the North. And so the intervention in this particular project, curriculum-wise, was to produce local texts created by students for students. And I'm delighted to say 3 edited volumes have been produced, focused on the project of storytelling and life writing. And I think, colleagues, I can go on and on talking about some fascinating examples. Please write to me if you wish, and I can give you a detailed spread of what is emanating in our project. But maybe just to conclude on that slide, just remain on that slide, Cindy, is to say, you know, what this presents us with a fascinating clash of epistemologies and values, and the urgency to engage the construction of knowledge in an engaged university that is reflective, directive, transformative, and the question around what is taught, how it's taught, and how learning happens is so central. And in a way, what this actually does tell us is that without a lack of diverse perspectives, we fall into a trap of what that very famous ecofeminist Vandana Shiva calls the monoculture of the mind. So in other words, what do we opt for? We opt for a multi-dimensional gaze to recognize the pluriversality of voices. And in many ways, sometimes that unsettles paradigms. And of course, unsettling can be negative, but I see it as a positive. Because, you know, to unsettle means that we take something seriously, and that perhaps a concluding statement would be curriculum transformation is not an event, but rather an ongoing process. And I think from what we see in this project is an exciting, inspirational set of interventions. I think I will be able to report in future time as to how fully the curriculum at some of our universities has changed, and largely, obviously, emanating from data related to this project. Dr. Mabizela and colleagues, I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Reddy, for a truly engaging and thought-provoking presentation on how you're all reimagining the humanities, how humanities can be decolonized, and actually placing students at the center of the entire enterprise. Thank you very much for that presentation, Professor Reddy. We will now move on to Professor Liz Lange, who is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Teaching and Learning at the University of Cape Town. And she will address us on teaching and learning. Over to you, Liz.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you, Vasu, for your presentation. It was really interesting. Colleagues, what I would like to do this afternoon is to offer a set of reflections about what it means and the difficulties that arise when the process of decolonization is to be implemented at institutional level, and the bureaucracy of the university needs to take charge in some aspects of that. In order to do that, I would like to talk about three main issues. I want to talk a little bit about the curriculum in the context of the decolonization of the university, and Vasu has mercifully touched on some very important conceptual matters, so I'm not going to repeat some of what he said. Then I want to talk about the specific work that a group called the Curriculum Change Working Group did at UCT during the Rhodes Must Fall period. And finally, I would like to talk about the process of trying to implement some of the outcomes of the work that this group of people did. So in relation to the first issue, the notion of the curriculum in the context of the decolonization of the university, I think that we all agree, and certainly Vasu mentioned this, that until fairly recent, the question for the what of the curriculum was not really present in our discussion in higher education. We were concerned about curriculum only in terms of a structure, in terms of access in an epistemological way, but we were not questioning the epistemologies we were accessing. And we were concerned about the democratization of knowledge, but in the sense of who has access to that knowledge. Hence the mobility and the articulation issues that characterize the NQF. So we had to wait quite a long time until the first emergence, if you want, of curriculum as something problematic that went beyond the NQF levels and how they articulated. And that was at around in 2008, when the issue of curriculum emerged in relation to the problem of identity and inclusivity in higher education through what we all refer to as the Sudian report. Now, one of the things that the Sudian report did and continue was to connect curriculum and institutional culture in powerful ways. And then there was silence in relation to curriculum, and at least sort of at the systemic level. And then the student movement happened with its sort of origin with the Rhodes Must Fall movement at UCT. So one of the interesting things for me in analyzing some of the difficulties in operationalizing or implementing a curriculum review from a decolonial perspective was the conflation between two things that are connected but are not the same. And so one is the academic curriculum, which is what Vasu was referring to in talking about Bernstein. the notion of a certain knowledge, a certain grammar of knowledge, a certain behavior and identity that comes within a disciplinary or professional field, and that it is taught in a formal space. The other curriculum that I think is confused with this one is the notion of the institutional curriculum, which is the knowledge that it is encoded in the beliefs and the values and the behaviors that are sort of embedded in the institutional life. And although these things are related, they are not the same. And changing the one does not necessarily change the other. And I think that this is something that it is important to keep in mind. So with that sort of introduction, let me move on to 2015, 2017, and the work of the CCWG at UCT. I think that first of all, one has to acknowledge the enormous importance and the emotionality and anger of the student movement at that point in time. So the notion and the experience of exclusion of Black students at white universities was very, very powerful, and that needed to be voiced, and it was voiced at UCT, at VETS, at Stellenbosch, at Pretoria, at Rhodes, in very, very intense ways. So thinking about knowledge in that context was clearly a very important political task. And it was very much part of a denunciation of the university as institution. So it's the notion of deauthorizing the university as institution was accompanied by the need or by the impetus to deauthorize the knowledge that the university teaches. So that's the context in which the CCWG emerged. It emerged, interestingly enough, as a parallel process. So instead of the CCWG being a committee that comes out of the Senate or that integrates with the committee system that all universities have, the CCWG, by absolute need of the political moment, was completely taken out of that process, and it was set up as a proposal from Black academics and Black students, and it was supported as a structure and through funding by the then Vice-Chancellor of the university. What the CCWG wanted to do was to provide a different experience of curriculum in the context of Rosmats Fall. But they went and they did many other things that were very important for the university. They created a space and facilitated conversations between staff and students that possibly without them they wouldn't have happened. It intervened, or it acted, if you want, both as a catalyst for change, but also as a kind of cathartic space in which the anger and the frustration of both Black academics and students could come through and express itself. It provided a first instance of acknowledging the specific experience of Black students at UCT, and address in emotional ways what Serban calls the problem of existential inequality. In doing all of this at an emotional level, from an epistemological level, the CCWG work within the decolonial school, and of course address the notion of the coloniality of power, the coloniality of being, the coloniality of knowledge, and they added the notion of the coloniality of doing. Now, at the time of trying to implement the conclusions of the CCWG, we find that in the documented work, there was a constant slippage between the decolonial critique of the institutional culture and the decolonial critique of the academic curriculum. And the problem here was that the decolonial critique of the curriculum did not address some of the curricular problems that were plaguing students beyond the issue of the content and beyond the positionality of teachers and students. And I think that this has to do with the fact that the decolonial theory has not yet developed a theory of curriculum within its sort of knowledge, body of knowledge. So students were experiencing a number of problems with the curriculum that have to do with the structure, with the volume, with the credits, with the relationship between what they were learning and the real world practice, depending on the disciplines, articulation with the schooling, even at UCT. And so all of those problems were serious obstacles for students. CCWG, again, is Curriculum Change Working Group. Thank you, Denise. When I came to UCT, they gave me 2 pages that were full of acronyms as my guide to institutional culture. Sorry for that. So one of the problems for me personally in trying to take these things into practice was how to bring the decolonization of the curriculum into a process of review of the curriculum that dealt simultaneously with all the other problems that were the ones that were making students fail and that were creating gaps between the performance of different groups of students, etc. So what do we do? What we did was trying a synthesis. And the synthesis meant that we took from the work of the Curriculum Change Working Group, all the elements that we thought were important as principles for a review of the curriculum, and to that we added others that intended to help academics to navigate the way into curriculum review. So I give you some examples of this. One of the principles was that the curriculum review needs to be explicit about the genealogy of knowledge and about the intellectual history of the disciplines, including their effects of power. So what Dr. Mabizela said at the beginning about what knowledge, whose knowledge, what or who gets privilege, and whose interests dominate, were the questions suggested to interrogate the curriculum. And this was a fundamental contribution that the CCWG did to this process. Then was reasserting the notion that curriculum also implies a pedagogy, and that pedagogy needs to happen with due regard with how knowledge takes place, how learning happens, who the learner is, what it means to know, and what are the outcomes of learning that are expected. The next principles were the notion that curriculum needs to help students to make sense of the different grammars of the disciplinary fields, and of course this also comes from Bernstein, and then the need to democratize pedagogy in such a way that there is a democratic and transparent relationship between academics and students that allows for the recognition of the student in the fullness of the sociological and emotional being of the student. So if I think in terms of, I mean, there are other principles, but that's, I mean, this gives you a sense of what we were trying to do. What this process did, when I look at it on hindsight, is that it took the most radical aspects of the discourse of the decolonization of the curriculum out of the academic process. And of course, this created considerable debate and opposition. But the point was, how do you bring the whole university or the largest part of the university to move in this direction if people cannot recognize sufficiently the space to move, and if they feel completely sort of unmoored, if you want. So that was difficult. I am not entirely sure that we have succeeded, but in many respects, and it is interesting because most of this work tends to be done either in the humanities or in disciplines that are very close to the humanities. So we need to be able to translate this thing for the geologists and the engineers and the mathematicians, because the decolonization of the disciplines is not a matter of the humanities, as Vasu rightly mentioned. So how do we do this thing without turning a very powerful process into a blunt tool? And for me, this keeps on being a question that has no answer, and that needs to be tried and retried and being sorted out through debate and pressure. Of course, COVID came and interrupted the process of what we were doing, but my sense is that the review of the curriculum is taking place at universities, certainly at UCT, and for what Vasu is showing at other universities, almost organically. The examples of decolonized curriculum across the disciplines is becoming really, really interesting, and I think that there is a huge opportunity for a proper engagement with knowledge and with the difficulties of curriculum as curriculum, with the work that we have been doing up to now. So, Sizwe, I stop here. I think that I've done my 20 minutes. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Liz, for that very deep reflection on some of what UCT has done to deal with the issue of decolonization. I think we'll come back because there's some really important questions to raise here. I do invite our audience to note their questions because we'll come back and ask some really sharp questions. Let's move on. So thank you very much, Liz, for that presentation. Let's move on to the next presenter, Ms. Trudy van Wyk, who, as I indicated, is in the Department of Higher Education and Training. And she will speak on the impact of the report of the Ministerial Task Team on the Fourth Industrial Revolution on teaching and learning. Over to you, Trudy.
Thank you, Prof. And good afternoon to all the participants that are still here. I'm not sure how many are still here, but I'm confident that I know there's still people here. I'm talking specifically today, I've got a descriptive presentation of the work of the Ministerial Task Team on the Fourth Industrial Revolution in the PSET. Now, I think the first question is, how does this fit into this theme? But I think it's very important that I'm only going to focus on teaching and learning, on the curriculum. And as the chairperson has said in his introduction, what do we teach? How do you teach it? Do we know the students who are sitting in front of us or who are at the other side of the screen that we are teaching? And what are their realities? What is their identity? And I think this fits in very well with the two previous presentations. And I also want to say that Minister Nzamandi's presentation this morning, or introduction or keynote, made my presentation very easy, because a lot of what he has said is also reflected in this report. And it just shows that there is coherence in what we are doing. So my presentation is specifically on the report of the Ministerial Task Team on the Fourth Industrial Revolution. It has just been released. It's available on our website of the DHET. And I think you're going to win a prize if you find it on the website. So you go to call for public comments, and under that you will find this report, and you will see later on why the call for public comments is the place to look for it. But within the theme of engaged in a university, I think we have spoken a lot about the curriculum, the relevance, the curriculum, but the other reality that we're sitting with is technology, change as a construct, and the contextual changes that are taking place. So that's also the background that the Ministerial Task Team has been established. So in November 2019, our minister established the Ministerial Task Team under the leadership of Professor Zeblon Vilakazi, and with 10 thought leaders and experts, they had to look at three things. The first is the contribution that the PSET system can make to the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and that is research and innovation. The second one is, how does the PSET system provide and produce skills that are in line with the needs of the Fourth Industrial Revolution? It's building the capacity for our students when they leave the institution to function in a world, in a changed world, in a world that we don't know. And then lastly, and I think that is what I'm going to focus on today, is how do we embrace the affordances of the Fourth Industrial Revolution within our teaching and learning. And there's just the indication of who were the members, so you will recognize some of these people. As background, I just want to start with the Presidential Commission on the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And there's one work stream on the South African human capacity development ecosystem. And that puts the ecosystem right from birth, right through to the older population and to death. But central to this is the PSET system. And I highlighted here in this frame that the PSET system is so central in the South African human capacity development ecosystem. And interestingly, we didn't, as the Ministerial Task Team, work on the recommendations of the Presidential Commission. But if you look at what they said here in their systemic view on human capacity building, and what the Ministerial Task Team has said is totally aligned. And I think especially the fourth one, that fits in very closely with what we are discussing today, is curriculum relevance, the competency, the skills, the competency and skills to be developed of creativity, problem solving, and so forth, the so-called soft skills. And then also foundational skills like literacy, numeracy, and digital literacy, because that is the reality of the student, of our institution, but also of the world of work. But if you look at the 7 issues that, no, I'm lying, yeah, 8 issues that are outlined here. We're looking at a technology-enabled learning environment. We're looking at accreditation and certification, and your teacher or lecturer reskilling, and then curriculum relevance, the ecosystem, the agility, and the redesign that we have to do all the time. And I think the 2 previous speakers did it so well to say, how do we relook at the ecosystem that we are living in? And then obviously entrepreneurship, the linkage with industry and relationship, and then the access to decent work. And then also in the curriculum, I think the how that they highlight was not necessarily the STEM subjects and the STEM disciplines that they're talking about, but more also about the arts, about humanities, and teaching the current curriculum. And it's very important, and I think it's very significant that it's also bringing from the Presidential Commission into the work of the Ministerial Task Team. So if we look at the 4th Industrial Revolution, and this is the last time I'm going to talk about technology, it is about the technology revolution. That is the definition, if you find in literature, the definition of the 4th Industrial Revolution. But it's also about how do we change the business models and government? And then I think most important is that how do we transform society? And I think the most important thing for me is to superimpose your PSET institution, your university, your TVET college, your CET college on this and see how do you embrace the technology revolution? How do you change business models? And I think Liz has spoken a lot about that. How do you change the business models and the governance of institutions, as well as transform the society? When we then look at the report itself, and I think the general issues that the implications of the 4th Industrial Revolution for the PSET are things like the large-scale decline in some areas of paid work, as tasks within these roles become automated or redundant, accompanied by growth in new products and services, and associated new tasks and paid work generated by the adoption of new technologies. And that is the implication and the reality that we have to work with, but also the demand, not only for functional skills, but also for the soft or the transferable skills, such as creativity, originality and initiative, critical thinking, persuasion and negotiation, and those will retain or increase their value, as will the attention to detail, resilience, flexibility, and complex problem solving. The next point is the composition of skills required to perform a job and to perform teaching and learning in specific will change with the advent of the 4th Industrial Revolution, but also that more short-term work, often via online work platforms, that make certain types of work available on more flexible basis is the reality. Laptops, tablets, smartphones, data access, connectivity, digital competence are tools for work and for study, and technology is only a tool. The data and the information and the knowledge is the fuel. And I think we all have to acknowledge that it's not about the technology, but it's about how do we utilize technology to transform our system and to let teaching and learning take place. The next point is that education and training systems require to become far more agile, and all people to expect to engage much more actively in lifelong learning and societies and economies transformation. So if we look at the general implications, there are specific implications for education and training system. And those are that new skills will be required to create, maintain, and leverage these new technologies. This will require the formal PSET system working in partnership with government, departments, and employers to repurpose and refigure curriculum, considering lifelong learning and the need for a broader and more agile PSET system to respond to the skills needs as they arise. And then also the social consequences of the fourth industrial revolution will demand much larger scale access to education and training opportunities for all South Africans, with a focus on those who have been excluded from the PSET historically or whose prior education has failed them, as well as with ongoing access for people to move in and out of the PSET system throughout their lives. Education and training opportunities to which people have access are meaningful and relevant in the context of a rapid changing world of work. The next point is that the shift from the current predominant content-focused programs and curriculum that prepare people at the beginning of their working lives for permanent employment towards becoming more holistic, focused on developing a broader range of capabilities that are required for success at work and for the development of the individual. And then lastly, specialized skills, content, knowledge, and abilities will grow in importance, and PSET institutions will need to play a critical role in providing access to them. The disciplinary bodies of knowledge remain at the core of effective PSET, as increasingly does the need for interdisciplinary engagement. So if we go to the next slide, is what does the entity envision for teaching and learning? And in no specific order are they on the slide, but I'm just going to go through the points. The first one is a strong core of education and training programs that are aligned with the changing needs of both South African society and the world of work in the context of the fourth industrial revolution. Secondly, access to high quality educational opportunities that meet immediate demand for digital skills in the labor market created by the fourth industrial revolution. The next is massive increases in short course skilling opportunities for unemployed and underemployed South Africans in parallel with wider government and private sector efforts to rapidly grow new employment opportunities for those people. The next point is growing emphasis on PSET programs and courses that emphasize key generic skills such as problem solving, critical thinking, advanced literacy and numeracy skills, oral and written communication skills, the capacity for ethical reasoning, and the ability to work effectively in teams, among others. Then the curriculum and educational programs that are responsive to the accelerating pace of technological change and the world of work is necessary, as well as an open loop education platform in which students can combine building a strong initial education foundation with ongoing educational skills acquisition opportunities throughout their lives. Furthermore, educational approaches that enable much greater flexibility in terms of how and where students access learning opportunities and a wider and more pervasive application of work-integrated learning in PSET, recognizing that the workplace is an essential site of learning, and also that it will be critical to be able to bring PSET to the workplace, given that many learners may need to continue working while they are studying. And then a very important point, and that came up also through the Presidential Commission, is accreditation systems that allow students to accumulate stackable macro-credentials and recognition of learning outside formal national qualifications throughout a lifelong learning career. And the modes of educational delivery that embrace the principles of open learning and integrated delivery models that work at district and regional levels and that enable PSET institutions to work together with public and private enterprises, with social structures, with the communities they serve, and with local district and provincial government to create articulated, seamless, responsive education and development opportunities. So what does the report now say we have to do? So If we want to succeed in the fourth industrial revolution, it identifies certain dependencies and enablers that we all as a PSET system have to do. But I think what is important also is that the team acknowledge that a lot of work is already taking place, a lot of initiatives. It's just amazing what is already happening at our universities. But there is firstly a need for a new vision for the PSET system, can only be successful if it's implemented in parallel with aligned development strategies in other sectors of the economy and society. Secondly, that partnerships and collaboration between employers, industry bodies, public and private PSET providers, the government and civil society is a basis for co-creation and joint adoption of curricula, programs and short courses that are aligned to the needs of both society and the changing labor market. Thirdly, flexibility in admission criteria, curriculum design, learning and teaching modes, assessment, and more flexible quality assurance systems, both at institutional and national levels, are necessary, which are capable of assuring quality across a wider range of educational modalities. Next is an integrated ecosystem that connects learning with opportunities, pathways, and a spectrum of workforce and support resources that are accessible and inclusive for those who are at risk of being systematically locked out of the labor market by the fourth industrial revolution, as well as for those who are already excluded. And then the ongoing mobilization of funds and human capacity to invest in curriculum design, program and course development and review processes, development of teaching and learning materials of different kinds, and the judicious use of information and communication technologies and e-learning, and ongoing continuous professional development for lecturers and academics. It also then talked long about digital inclusion, and I'm not going to go into detail. That's right from the access to hardware, the reliability and the affordability of internet connections for students and staff, information literacy, effective integration of technology into teaching and learning, and very important, technical and pedagogical support and the access to applications and content. Then also to ensure that effective and ongoing student support is provided through investment in closing foundational learning gaps, creating conducive environments for independent learning, avail well-planned and effective coordinated academic support, and advising to all students as an integral part of the overall educational experience. Then the next one is build a micro-credentialing system and develop a simpler and more flexible policy frameworks, especially those responsible for governing programs, accreditation, and quality assurance. Also, the development of a systemic regional approach to initiate integrated fourth IR-related developments at the regional level and to develop agile funding models to incubate critical skills that do not necessarily seek to introduce new money into the system, but rather direct existing budgetary allocations to cost-effective models that can quickly and effectively upgrade the employability of youth and transition them into income-generating opportunities that the fourth industrial revolution presents, which need human capital. So what is the way forward in the last 2 minutes and 9 seconds that I have is that, as I said, the report is available at the moment on our website, so you can look under public comments. It's a very interesting way to find it. And we are asking the public by the 8th of November, so we're giving them a month to look at the report and to assist the department in how to take the report forward. The report is just a report that gives ideas and it gives recommendations, but how are we going to take this forward? Those ideas are so important for the department, and we therefore really ask that universities and even individuals can comment on this within a month, and then within the next 3 months we will take that forward, integrate the national plan for PSET and other strategies like the Department of Science and Innovation strategy, integrate it within this and devise a plan on how to take the recommendations of this report forward. With a few seconds left, Chairperson, I say thank you for the opportunity to present this report.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Trudy, for sharing that report with us. Very, very important report, and how it will contribute to advancing the quality of teaching and learning. So thank you very much for that. So we will take some questions. We have about 15 minutes for questions. So let me just read some that have come through. I think this goes to, let me just see. Let's start with you, Vasu. Some questions which were directed to you. Let me just locate them. I think Liz has already addressed the issue, or maybe let's start with you, Liz, because you may have to leave sooner. Can you tell who in South Africa is developing curriculum development frames for decolonizing the curriculum? I think that is directed to you, Liz, or maybe Vasu might also respond.
I'm sure Vasu can respond also. Look, I mean, I do not know of framings that are being developed, but certainly HELTASA has been proposing a number of approaches at the national level, and I think that that's very, very useful. We have been doing a little bit of work ourselves, but I mean, I think that the best work that you can find is the work that HELTASA is doing, and through HELTASA into individuals that are progressing in that regard.
But before you leave, because you have indicated that you have time constraints, based on your presentation, and I think Vasu might also want to have a take on this. Let's accept that education is fundamentally political. And I think Vasu indicated it is not neutral. And it is also power. So when we talk about decolonization, aren't we just tinkering around the margins at the moment and not really confronting this issue at its very center, that it is really about power? And then how do we then talk about decolonization? How do we decolonize? And that is one part of the question. The second part is, there are probably many conceptions of decolonization. I subscribe to one which is not about replacement, removing Western, well, what is designated as Western knowledge, but to decenter it and to create space for other knowledges and therefore enrich the educational experience of our students. So what is your take on that? The first part is about education as being political and therefore really tackling this thing head on rather than tinkering around the margins. And the second part.
Look, I mean, I fully agreed. I mean, my personal view is that education is probably the most political act that one can embark on, and certainly for me, education has been my politics. So absolutely agree. I do agree that we need to sort of head this thing, to sort of go for this thing head on. The point is, what sort of versions and interpretations emerge of this? Because I mean, what Vasu has put on the table is an extraordinarily open and broad understanding of decolonization that includes a world. And I think that that's very, very interesting. But if we end up with a very narrow politics of identity around this, I think that we are lost. So for me, it is very important to denounce the power in the disciplines and in the knowledge, and decenter as you had said, the notion that the only knowledge that exists is Western and white and male. But we need to do it in such a way that we don't throw the baby with the bathwater. So, sorry, if I may add tongue in cheek, if you read Maldonado Torres, Quijano, Dussel, etc., all of them sang Heidegger and Levinas and etc. So we are all thinking against and with, but we cannot think without. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Vasu, before you give your own take on this one, let me just take this question which has been asked. How would you explore the integration of decolonization and transformation into the current, I think, language of teaching and learning, a focus area?
Well, thank you. I couldn't but agree with Liz. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think we share, politically in philosophy that education is not neutral. We know that. I mean, you enter a classroom, you're not just simply imparting knowledge, you're a body, you're assessed, you're faced with, what is it that you can do, convey and how you do it. And all sorts of perceptions and assumptions arise beyond, what you start actually propagating and lecturing. So that's very, very powerful. And I mean, you cannot run away from the fact that the decolonial turn is not just simply epistemological or ontological, it's deeply political. And what I wanted to say is that it might seem that this is all easygoing, but the truth of the matter, there are deep resistances. If I could, use bad grammar and say that is often how it is experienced in universities. Challenges countering this need and urgency to make change significantly. So I think that's something that I would agree with wholeheartedly. Power is central to these dynamics. I didn't get the second question, Sizwe. Did you mention?
Maybe I'll ask Denise to read it. Denise, can you read that question?
Let me unmute. So you're talking about the question that came directly to Vasu?
Yes, yes.
It was a question just really asking for some feedback on how these initiatives were being received by the students.
Oh, yes.
That was one of them. Do you want the other one as well?
Was about something related to what would a decolonized curriculum look like.
Yes.
No, I mean, the first one around student responses, I think, I don't know if it was Dr. Tony who asked that question when I read it. And, I think what Dr. Tony offers is a very interesting intervention that we're making in terms of this project. Because as I said, it's descriptive, it's iterative, all of those sort of things. And I cannot speak on behalf of all universities involved in the project, but I can certainly say that where we are, where I'm located at UP, there's certainly been, uptake, student involvement. I think it's a monitoring and evaluation question. I don't want to be bureaucratic about that in terms of processes, but there's certainly been an active engagement with students and students also offering alternatives and options in saying, this works, but we would like this. I mean, I teach as well as a dean in the faculty, and I get queries. For example, I teach social theory in sociology, and I've been able to sort of, move beyond this canon of Marx, Weber, Giddens, and Heidegger, and so many other colleagues that we would think that seem to be central to this notion of canon. And what is it, sociologically speaking, that we bring to the canon in terms of changing the perspectives? So experiences are iterative, changing, but not defined. My own view at a personal level is that I do think that we need to have greater student involvement, frankly, in curriculum design, because students, they're not just simply imbibers of knowledge. they're able to critically engage with you. I mean, they tell you, I mean, it's an entangled process, and that I think more work needs to be done on that, if I could offer that response to Dr. Tony. But maybe the second question around what would a decolonized curriculum look like? Frankly speaking, I would be doing a disservice by saying this is a formula for what a decolonized curriculum would look like. But I can say, what are some of its ingredients? Some of its ingredients would be, such a curriculum would be adaptive, agile, iterative, topical, relevant. Certainly, I mean, that might sound like a generic set of statements. How do we engage voices that are often not included in our curriculum, and yet they are contributing to debate, discussion, knowledge making, remaking? They are raised our own scholars in the African continent who are producing great work in the South African context are often not cited because they do not seem to be, telling anything new. This is all perceptions. And that's where I think the big work is. It's about challenging received assumptions. It's about centering experience. It's not only unique to humanities and social sciences broadly across the curriculum, but perhaps more importantly, how do we undo these issues? And for me, fundamentally, a curriculum is never fixed. It's unfinished business. A good teacher, a good learner, is fundamentally reevaluating that curriculum on a yearly basis and not repeating it the year after. There may well be some core things. That would be a short response.
Thank you very much, Vasu. Trudy, two quick questions for you. Who were the members of the task team? And secondly, could you just repeat where that report can be accessed?
That's a very easy one, Chairperson. I've put it up in the chat. So I've put the link up in the chat, and Denise said that she will distribute it to the participants, and also the names are put up in the chat. I don't know if you want me to repeat the names, but it is already there.
Okay. No, thank you. Just one last question. And as part of this decolonization and transformation engagement, there is a tendency to problematize students, to look at them as being deficient and so on and so forth. And we have all interventions to try to bring them up to speed because they lack this, that, or the other. Why do we do that and not really confront the real issue, which is not just the students, but I think, Liz, you alluded to the institutional culture and other things. Why can't we adopt an approach which recognizes what students bring with them and build on that, rather than seeing them as being deficient and have all manner of interventions to try to bring them up to a level where we believe they should be? Liz?
Yes. I think that things have improved substantially in that regard. I mean, of course, there is still this thing that everybody would wish that they have a middle class autonomous student, and that's fine, and that's the only model. But I think that more and more we are understanding that our duty professionally, but also our moral obligation is to respond at the student that we have in front of us. And the recognition that I talk about of the student is a very important part of that. And it's not recognizing the student as deficient, it's recognizing the student as a student, who they are. So I think that my concern, I must say, is not so much about how do we think the student. My concern is that we are not critical enough about the society in which we and the students are inserted, and what this society and our failures as this country are doing to those students. It's a very real thing that we need to pick up things, but it's not the students' fault.
If I
So,
could, no.
sorry, I mean, just I'm getting too enthusiastic about this. Sorry.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just triggered. And if I could just add to that, I think, Dr. Mabizela, it's good to problematize the student, but not just simply the student itself. And what Liz is alluding to is the interlocking factors. It's equally the person who is in the class. And that's where, if this particular session is titled Reflexive Conversations. So it's about how we as teachers too reflect on who we are and how we're coming to a particular subject that matters. And I think once we do that, and it's not just purely about positioning, it's equally important. I think there's nothing bad about problematizing, but I think we have to be equally reflective and reflexive as well, because in that process, you're able to actually negotiate a conversation, locating who you are and recognizing the diversity of students and not making assumptions that this is a uniform singular class of students. And that, I think, where knowledge is very powerful.
Sizwe, if I may, sorry.
Yes, Liz.
No, what Vasu is saying is fundamentally important. If we talk about the development of critical thinking, the first step in criticality is about oneself. And that goes for us as academics and teachers, and goes for the student. So it is fundamentally important that we teach the students to be critical of themselves and of the world in which they live. And to do this sort of sparring that Vasu is talking about. Anyway, shut up.
And can I just link that?
There are still a few questions. Trudy, we'll finish off now. I'll give each one of you a minute, but go ahead, Trudy.
Thank you. And I think I want to link that to a question that has been asked about the need for agile curriculum. And the question was that caters for teaching and learning of new technologies. And I think that is not what teaching and learning is about. I think teaching and learning is about coping with new realities and what skills do you need to cope with that new realities, and not one of our people sitting around here. And I don't think anybody in the world knows what the future will look like. I think 2 years ago, if we said we will work from home for 2 years, people would think, what? But the new realities are there and it's changing daily, minute by minute. And we must rather look, like Liz has said, for the need to prepare students for a changing world that we don't know how it looks like, but we have to give them the tools to survive in that life. And that the tools is not a technology tool, but that tool is a tool within the mind and in the fabric of the student and the lecturer and the academic.
Great. Liz, your final thought for 1 minute?
I don't have 1 minute thoughts. I just think that the discussion has been fantastic, and I hope that it was useful for the people who were listening, and has been a pleasure to share the conversation with you and with the co-panelists. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Liz. And Vasu?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of synergies, Dr. Mabizela, with all three presentations, all around a range of themes. I mean, one can do an analysis of that, but I think ultimately, really, I think the big questions remain is questions around access, success, technology, curriculum, but more importantly also that these are iterative, ongoing processes. They're not finished. Nobody has a silver bullet. And I think these conversations help to really take us forward in creative and innovative ways.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much to you all. And one of the things that I always share with my students is that it is important to feel comfortable in being uncomfortable, but also to feel uncomfortable in being comfortable. Because it is in the space of being uncomfortable that you start to imagine things differently. To our audience, thank you very much, and thanks for your participation in the form of questions. And I really want to thank each one of you, our speakers, for preparation and for the presentations. We are so deeply indebted to you. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bolshaya spasiba.